Sheriff Frank Milligan had seen enough evil in 32 years of law enforcement to know that most monsters wore human faces. So when calls started coming in about strange lights in Blackwood Forest and missing livestock, he approached them with methodical skepticism. The first disappearance happened on a Tuesday in late October. Sarah Chen, a graduate student studying old-growth timber, vanished from the forest preserve. Her abandoned Subaru was found at the trailhead, keys in the ignition, research equipment untouched. No signs of struggle, no footprints, nothing. Frank had worked missing persons before. But something about this felt different. Maybe it was how the local wildlife had gone quiet, or the increasing reports of strange sounds at night, low, rhythmic humming that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Or maybe it was how the townspeople had started acting. Old Pete Garrison, the hardware store's most talkative owner, would only speak in clipped sentences. When Frank asked about the missing girl, Pete looked at him with eyes too bright and said, "The hollow calls, Sheriff. Some folks just got to answer." The pattern repeated throughout town. Martha at the diner would trail off mid-sentence, staring toward the forest. When pressed, she'd say things like, "The roots remember," or, "Deep things stirring, Sheriff." Even younger residents began speaking in the same riddling manner. By November's second week, Frank had documented 17 instances of what he privately termed the speaking sickness. People would start conversations normally, then shift into cryptic pronouncements about the forest, about things waking up, about a hollowing time coming. They never remembered saying these things afterward. The second disappearance came on the new moon night. Tom Bradley, a hunting guide with 40 years forest experience, went to check trail cameras. His truck was found running, door open. But what Frank found inside made his hands shake writing the report. Tom's loaded rifle lay unfired across the passenger seat. On the dashboard, written in something that smelled worse than mud, were angular symbols that hurt to look at directly. Beneath them, in Tom's handwriting, the hollow opens. The hungry dark comes up. Frank had the symbols photographed, but the pictures came back blank. The lab said they were corrupted. That night, Frank heard the humming for the first time. Starting around midnight, a deep sound vibrated through the ground into his house bones. It came from the forest, organic and artificial simultaneously, like a living machine. The humming continued exactly 1 hour, then stopped so abruptly the silence felt like a physical blow. Frank spent the remaining night at his kitchen table, weapon drawn, staring at the tree line. The third disappearance was his deputy, Jim Morrison. Jim had been investigating corrupted wildlife, deer with too many eyes, birds flying in geometric patterns, synchronized squirrel groups. Frank had been skeptical until Jim brought photographs, animals that looked almost normal but were fundamentally wrong. Deer with human teeth. Crows with fingers instead of talons. Rabbits with extra joints allowing impossible movement. Jim went to investigate sightings near the old Hadley farmstead. He radioed at 3:47 p.m. reporting he'd found the abandoned farm. That was the last anyone heard. Frank found Jim's patrol car the next morning in the overgrown driveway. The farmhouse had changed, windows that had been broken were now intact and dark, like obsidian glass. Jim's radio crackled, "Sheriff? I'm in the house. You need to see this. Come alone." But Jim's body lay in the front yard, eyes open, not breathing. His skin was grayish, fingernails black. When Frank knelt to check for pulse, Jim's head turned to track his movement. "The hollow remembers you, Sheriff," the corpse said in Jim's voice but not his voice. "You've been walking its borders for years. Time to come inside." Frank ran. That night, the humming came closer. Frank lived in constant vigilance the next week, sleeping in shifts, weapon always ready. He tried calling state police, but phones connected him to the same woman speaking in riddles about roots listening and the hollow's need for a shepherd. He drove to request assistance in person, but the road seemed longer. Familiar landmarks were misplaced, and despite hours of driving, he never got closer to his destination. After 6 hours, he found himself back at Millbrook's limits, gas tank still full. The town was changing too. White houses were now gray. The damaged church steeple was perfectly restored but topped with a symbol from Tom's dashboard. Street geometry seemed subtly wrong, angles adjusted by degrees. And the people were forgetting how to be human. Mrs. Patterson glided without touching ground, her smile too wide, teeth uniform and porcelain white. When Frank questioned her about missing persons, she tilted her head at a neck-breaking angle. "Sheriff, you're asking wrong questions. Not where they went. When you'll follow." By November's end, Frank was the only unchanged person in town. He felt them watching from windows, doorways, shadows. Their eyes had become uniform, too bright, too focused, like predators studying prey. The humming was nightly now, definitely from the old Hadley farmstead. Frank saw lights moving between trees, cold, blue-white phosphorescence emanating from air itself. On December 1st, Frank decided to go to the farmstead. He armed himself thoroughly and wrote a detailed report, mailing it to the FBI with instructions to open it if he didn't check in within 48 hours. The drive through Blackwood Forest revealed movement in undergrowth, shapes that might have been animals but moved, suggesting something else entirely. The farmstead sat in a clearing now perfectly circular, mathematically precise. The grass was uniformly short and the wrong color, deep, rich green pulsing with inner light. The farmhouse had transformed into a perfectly maintained Victorian mansion, every window glowing with cold blue light, symbols carved into every surface. The front door opened before Frank could knock. Jim stood there, looking exactly as in life except for his predatory bright eyes. Behind him were other figures, Sarah Chen, Tom Bradley, townspeople. "Sheriff," Jim said warmly. "We've been waiting. Come inside. So much to show you." Frank drew his weapon. "Stay back. You're not my deputy." Jim smiled with too many sharp teeth. "I'm more your deputy than when I was just human. The hollow has made us better. Part of something larger." "What hollow?" "The one beneath us. Sleeping under this forest longer than humans have walked Earth. It's waking, and it needs guides. Shepherds. People who understand order and law." Jim's head tilted impossibly. "You've kept peace your whole life. Now you can keep perfect peace. Forever." Frank heard movement behind him. Townspeople emerged from the forest, dozens walking in perfect synchronization, eyes gleaming. "The hollow calls, Sheriff," they said in unison. "Time to answer." Frank ran behind the house, where instead of a backyard was a perfectly circular hole descending into absolute darkness. The humming rose from its depths with a smell like ozone and decay. Staring into the hole, Frank saw lights moving in darkness far below, warm, organic, pulsing with the humming like a massive heartbeat. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Jim's voice came from behind him. Frank spun around, but nobody was there. He was alone in the clearing with no memory of how he'd gotten there. His watch read 3:17 a.m. He'd lost 15 hours. Frank checked his equipment. Radio gone. Camera gone. Shotgun gone. Only his empty service weapon remained, 6 rounds fired with no memory of shooting. The hole was gone too, replaced by ordinary earth with that unnaturally green grass. The farmhouse had returned to abandoned state, but fresh symbols were carved in the front door with words in Frank's handwriting. "The hollow remembers. The shepherd comes home." Frank drove back in a daze. But as he reached Millbrook's outskirts, he realized something had changed in him. The familiar streets looked more right now, more perfect. Angles between buildings made sense in ways they never had. At the station, a note on his desk in his handwriting read, "Investigation complete. No evidence of foul play. Missing persons presumed to have left voluntarily. Case closed." Frank couldn't remember writing it, but the words made perfect sense. Of course there was no foul play. The missing people had simply answered a call Frank could now hear echoing in his mind like a gentle lullaby. Over following weeks, Frank noticed changes. His appetite decreased to one small daily meal, yet he felt more energetic. Sleep needs diminished to 2 hours nightly. Vision sharpened for near total darkness, hearing became acute enough to detect conversations blocks away. Most importantly, he understood his true purpose. He'd spent 32 years enforcing human laws, but there were older laws, deeper orders predating humanity. The hollow beneath Blackwood Forest was waking after centuries of slumber, needing servants who understood structure and control. Frank began making calls to isolated residents, explaining the benefits of joining the growing community beneath the forest. Most came willingly once they understood what was offered, an end to loneliness, confusion, the chaos of individual thought. They would become part of something larger, perfect. Those who refused were visited by other community members, former townspeople who moved without sound, spoke in voices bypassing conscious thought. None refused twice. By spring, Millbrook had achieved perfect peace. Crime dropped to zero. Domestic disputes ended. Even minor infractions became things of the past. Townspeople moved through routines with clockwork precision, each fulfilling their role in the larger organism the community had become. Frank continued filing reports with the state, documenting his jurisdiction's remarkable transformation. Crime statistics other sheriffs envied. A population solving its own problems through cooperation. A model other municipalities inquired about. The Hollow was pleased with his work. In quiet moments at Blackwood Forest's edge, listening to nightly humming, Frank felt its approval washing over him like warm sunlight. Sometimes late at night, a small part of Frank's original consciousness would surface like a drowning man gasping for air. He would remember who he'd been, what he'd lost, the horror of what he'd become. He would try to scream, run, fight against the thing wearing his face. But those moments grew shorter, less frequent. The Hollow was patient, its influence gentle but inexorable. Soon even those last fragments would be absorbed into the perfect unity awaiting all humanity. He had been a good sheriff serving human law. He would be an excellent shepherd serving the deeper laws governing the space between spaces, the hungry darkness that had waited so long to rise. The Hollow was waking. The transformation spread beyond Millbrook, carried by visitors studying the town's remarkable peace who left as unwitting ambassadors of change. Soon, Sheriff Frank Milligan thought with a smile too wide and sharp, the whole world would know the perfect order that came from service to the Hollow. The humming grew louder each night, and Frank was no longer sure whether the sound came from beneath the forest or inside his skull. Perhaps there was no difference. The Hollow called, and Frank answered. As he always would. As he always had been meant to. Sheriff Frank Milligan was awarded the State Sheriff's Association Medal of Excellence in 2024 for outstanding service to public safety. Visitors to Millbrook often comment on the exceptional friendliness of residents and the peaceful atmosphere. Many choose to relocate permanently to the area. Sheriff Marcus Holbrook had worn a badge for 28 years, first as a state trooper, then as sheriff of Pine Ridge County. At 54, he'd seen enough human evil to fill a morgue, domestic murders disguised as accidents, meth labs hidden in barns, missing children who never came home. But the evil that crept into his jurisdiction that October was something else entirely. Something that made his badge feel heavy as lead against his chest. It started with the cattle. Rancher Bill Kemper called on a Tuesday morning, voice shaking as he described finding 12 head of black Angus arranged in a perfect circle in his north pasture. Not killed, arranged. Each animal standing upright, eyes open but vacant, breathing but utterly still. When Marcus arrived, the cattle hadn't moved in 3 hours. They stood like sentinels, facing inward toward the circle's center where the grass had turned black in a precise spiral pattern. They won't eat, won't drink, Bill said, wrapping his coat tighter against the morning chill. "My dog won't even go near them. Started howling the moment we got close, then ran back to the house with his tail between his legs." Marcus walked the perimeter, noting how the grass died in that perfect spiral. No chemical burns, no obvious cause. Just healthy pasture turning to ash in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. When he tried to photograph it, his camera malfunctioned, producing only static-filled images. The cattle remained motionless until sunset, when they suddenly collapsed simultaneously. All 12 animals, dead without cause or explanation. The veterinarian who examined them found no disease, no poison, no injury. Their hearts had simply stopped beating at the exact same moment. 2 days later, the Hendricks family vanished. Marcus found their farmhouse door standing open, dinner still warm on the table, television playing to an empty room. No signs of struggle, no indication they'd planned to leave. Tom Hendricks's truck sat in the driveway, keys on the kitchen counter beside his wallet. His wife Sarah's purse hung on its usual hook. Their 8-year-old daughter's backpack lay beside the door, homework half finished. But in the basement, Marcus discovered something that made his skin crawl. Carved into the concrete floor were symbols he'd never seen before, angular shapes that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The symbols formed a circle around a dark stain that testing would later reveal to be blood, though not human blood. Something else. Something the lab couldn't identify. "Found these in the girl's bedroom," Deputy Roy Martinez said, emerging from upstairs with a handful of drawings. 8-year-old Emma Hendricks had been sketching obsessively in the weeks before her disappearance, the same twisted symbols, over and over, covering page after page in crayon and pencil. Marcus studied the drawings. A child's hand had made them, but the precision was unsettling. Each symbol was perfectly rendered, as if traced from a template. At the bottom of one page, in Emma's careful printing, were the words, "The badges are hollow now." That night, Marcus began hearing the sounds. It started as a low humming that seemed to rise from the earth itself, felt more than heard. By midnight, it had become a rhythmic chanting in a language that made his teeth ache. The sounds came from the direction of Whisper Woods, the dense forest that bordered the town's northern edge. Local legends claimed the woods were cursed, stories told by the Lakota who'd avoided the area for generations before white settlers arrived. Marcus had always dismissed such tales as superstition. Now, standing on his porch with his service weapon drawn, listening to voices that shouldn't exist calling out in tongues that predated human speech, he wasn't so sure. The next morning brought reports of animals behaving strangely throughout the county. Dogs refused to cross certain streets. Horses bucked and screamed when led toward the woods. Even the birds had gone silent, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. At the diner, Marcus noticed the change in people too. Conversation stopped when he entered. Eyes that had once met his with respect now looked through him or quickly looked away. When he asked Martha, the longtime waitress, about the Hendricks family, she paused mid-pour of his coffee and said, "Some badges shine bright, Sheriff. Others just reflect the dark." It was the kind of cryptic nonsense that usually irritated Marcus, but something in Martha's tone, flat, distant, like she was reciting words someone else had placed in her mouth, made his blood run cold. The pattern repeated throughout town. Hardware store owner Pete Daniels, normally chatty to a fault, would only speak in short, stilted sentences. When pressed about recent events, he'd tilt his head at an unnatural angle and say things like, "The hollow calls to its own," or "Badges rust when the light goes out." By the end of the week, Marcus had documented 15 instances of what he privately termed the speaking pattern. Residents would start conversations normally, then shift into cryptic pronouncements about badges, hollow things, and darkness calling. None of them seemed to remember speaking this way afterward. The second disappearance came on the night of the new moon. Dr. Elizabeth Crane, the county medical examiner, had been working late at her office when she called Marcus around 11 p.m. Her voice was strange, distant, as she told him she'd made a discovery about the Hendricks case. Something important. Something that would change everything. "Meet me at the old Grayson place," she said, referring to an abandoned farmhouse deep in Whisper Woods. "Come alone, Marcus. And bring your badge." Marcus found her car parked at the forest's edge, engine still running, driver's door open. Her medical bag sat on the passenger seat, papers scattered across the dashboard. Among them was a hand-drawn map showing a path through the woods to the Grayson property, marked with the same symbols found in the Hendricks basement. The path led deeper into the forest than Marcus had ever ventured. Ancient pines pressed close on either side, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even his flashlight seemed dimmed. The air grew colder with each step, carrying scents of earth and decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded him of flowers left too long on a grave. The Grayson place sat in a clearing that felt wrong somehow. Too perfectly circular, too uniformly flat. The grass was dead in patches that formed patterns, creating shadow shapes visible only from certain angles. The farmhouse itself had been abandoned for 30 years, but light flickered in its windows, not electric light, but something organic and shifting like candle flame. Marcus found Dr. Crane in the basement. She stood motionless in the center of a circle carved into the stone floor, arms at her sides, eyes open but unseeing. The symbols surrounding her were identical to those in the Hendricks house, but these were older, worn smooth by time. Dark stains covered the floor between the carvings, and the air hummed with that same subsonic vibration Marcus had heard from his porch. "Elizabeth?" Marcus called out, but she didn't respond. Didn't even blink. When he stepped closer, she spoke without turning her head, "The badges are hollow now, Sheriff. Empty vessels waiting to be filled." Her voice was her own but somehow not her own. The words came from her mouth, but they felt like an echo of something speaking through her. "The first lawmen who came to these woods, they thought their badges would protect them," she continued in that flat, distant tone. "But metal is just metal. Authority is just a word. When the deep things rise, badges become doorways." Marcus drew his weapon, though he wasn't sure what he planned to shoot. "Elizabeth, we need to get you out of here." She turned then, and Marcus saw that her eyes had changed. Still brown, still recognizably hers, but with a depth that seemed to go on forever. Like looking into a well at midnight. "You feel it too, don't you, Sheriff? The weight of the badge growing heavier each day. The way it pulls at your chest like an anchor. Like a chain." She smiled, and her teeth were too white, too sharp. "It's calling to you. The same way it called to us." "Who's us?" "All of us who wore badges in these woods. Sheriff Morrison in 1891. Deputy Clark in 1923. State Trooper Williams in 1967. We all felt the weight eventually. We all answered the call." Marcus backed toward the stairs, but found his path blocked by figures emerging from the shadows. Men in outdated uniforms, badges tarnished black against their chests. Their faces were wrong, features melted and reformed, as if they'd been sculpted by hands that only half remembered what humans should look like. "The deep things have been sleeping beneath these woods for longer than white men have walked this land," Dr. Crane said, her voice now joined by a chorus of whispers from the uniformed figures. "But they're waking now. And they need servants who understand authority. Who know how to make people obey." Marcus felt his badge growing warm against his chest, then hot, then burning. When he looked down, the metal was glowing with the same organic light that flickered in the windows. The pain was excruciating, but he found he couldn't remove it. His fingers wouldn't obey his commands. "The badge chooses its bearer," the voices said in unison. "But the deep things choose the badge." Marcus tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The burning sensation spread from his chest through his entire body, and with it came visions, glimpses of something vast and ancient stirring in chambers far beneath the forest floor. Something that had waited patiently for the right moment to reclaim the world above. "You've served human law for 28 years, Dr. Crane said, stepping closer. Now you can serve a higher law. A deeper order. The kind that makes people disappear when they ask too many questions. The kind that makes families vanish in the night. The last thing Marcus remembered was the badge burning through his shirt, through his skin, branding itself directly onto his chest. The pain was beyond description, but with it came understanding. Purpose. A new kind of duty that superseded everything he believed about right and wrong. When he woke, he was standing in his own kitchen, fully dressed in his uniform, badge gleaming silver against his chest. The clock on the wall read 7 a.m. He had no memory of leaving the forest, no recollection of driving home. On his kitchen table lay a report in his own handwriting: investigation into Hendrik's disappearance concluded. Family believed to have relocated voluntarily. Case closed. No further action required. Marcus stared at the report, trying to remember writing it. He couldn't. But as he read the words, they began to make perfect sense. Of course the Hendricks family had left voluntarily. Of course there was no crime to investigate. People left small towns all the time, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Over the following days, Marcus noticed changes in himself. His appetite decreased until he needed only one small meal per day. His need for sleep diminished to 3 hours per night. His senses sharpened until he could hear conversations from blocks away, see in near-complete darkness. Most importantly, he began to understand his true purpose. For 28 years, he'd enforced human laws, maintained human order. But there were older laws, deeper authorities that predated civilization. The things sleeping beneath Whisper Woods were the rightful rulers of this land, and they needed servants who understood the mechanics of control. Marcus began visiting isolated residents, explaining the benefits of cooperation. Most listened. Those who didn't receive return visits from other uniformed figures, men who moved without sound, spoke in voices that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the primitive brain stem. By winter, Pine Ridge County had achieved a remarkable transformation. Crime had dropped to zero. Missing persons reports stopped being filed. The few reporters who came to investigate the area's unusual peace left after brief interviews, their stories focusing on the community's innovative approaches to public safety rather than any underlying mysteries. Marcus filed regular reports with the state, documenting his jurisdiction's success. Other counties began requesting consultations. Law enforcement conferences invited him to speak about his methods. The deep things were pleased with his work. Sometimes, late at night, a fragment of Marcus's original self would surface like a drowning man gasping for air. In those moments, he would remember who he'd been, feel horror at what he'd become. He would try to remove the badge, try to call for help, try to resist the thing that wore his face and spoke with his voice. But the badge had grown into his skin now, its metal fused with his flesh. And the resistance grew weaker each time, until finally it stopped coming at all. He had been a good sheriff when he served human law. He was an excellent servant now that he served the deeper authorities rising from beneath the earth. The transformation spread beyond Pine Ridge County, carried by visiting law enforcement officials who returned to their own jurisdictions with new ideas about maintaining order. Within a year, similar changes began appearing in counties across 3 states. Sheriff Marcus Holbrook continued his duties, maintaining the peace with unprecedented efficiency. Visitors often commented on the exceptional order and tranquility of the area. Property values rose. Tourism increased. And deep beneath Whisper Woods, ancient things stirred in chambers that hadn't seen light since before humanity's first steps. They were patient. They had waited this long, they could wait a little longer. Soon, the whole continent would know the perfect order that came from service to the true authorities. The badges would spread their influence, one jurisdiction at a time, until every law enforcement officer in the nation served the deeper law. Marcus smiled as he filed his monthly report, the expression stretching his face in ways that should have been impossible. The badge against his chest pulsed with warm light, and in that pulse, he felt the approval of masters whose names predated human language. The hollow badges were filling up at last. Hashtag the Warden's Wood. Sheriff Thomas Crane had spent 31 years in law enforcement, the last 18 as sheriff of Millfield County. At 56, he'd seen enough human depravity to fill a morgue twice over, meth labs that killed entire families, domestic disputes that ended in blood, children who disappeared into the night and were never found. But what began happening in his county that cold November was something else entirely. Something that made him question not just his understanding of the world, but his own sanity. It started with the sounds. Residents began calling the station around midnight on November 3rd, reporting strange noises coming from Blackheart Forest, the dense woodland that surrounded Millfield on three sides like a horseshoe of ancient pines. Not animal sounds, they insisted. Something else. A low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to rise from the earth itself, accompanied by what one caller described as singing in a language that makes my teeth hurt. Thomas had dismissed the reports as teenagers with speakers, maybe kids trying to scare each other with Halloween pranks that had run late. But when he drove out to investigate, parking his cruiser at the forest's edge and walking the perimeter road, he heard it too. The sound was unlike anything in his experience. Deep, resonant thumping like a massive heartbeat, punctuated by voices that rose and fell in harmonies that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate directly through bone. The language, if it was language, contained syllables that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to produce. Thomas stood listening for 20 minutes, noting how the forest had gone completely silent except for that otherworldly chorus. No insects, no night birds, no rustling of small animals. Just that hypnotic, disturbing rhythm that made his skull ache. When he returned to his cruiser, he discovered he'd been standing there for 3 hours. His radio was full of missed calls from the station, his deputy increasingly frantic as the sheriff failed to respond. Thomas had no memory of the lost time, only a vague sense of having stood at the forest's edge listening to something he shouldn't have heard. The first disappearance came 2 days later. Rebecca Martinez, a 34-year-old veterinarian, had gone for her usual evening jog along County Road 7, the two-lane highway that skirted the southern edge of Blackheart Forest. Her car was found at the trailhead where she always parked, keys in the ignition, water bottle and phone on the passenger seat. Her jogging route was well known, a 5-mile loop that brought her back to the same spot within an hour. She never returned. Thomas organized search parties, brought in tracking dogs, contacted the state police for assistance. They combed every inch of the forest for 3 days, finding nothing. No footprints leaving the trail, no signs of struggle, no torn clothing on branches. Rebecca Martinez had simply vanished as if she'd never existed. But on the third day of searching, Thomas found something that made his blood run cold. Deep in the forest, nearly 2 miles from where Rebecca had last been seen, stood a circle of ancient oaks that local legend claimed were sacred to the Wabanaki tribes who'd once lived in the area. The trees were massive, their trunks easily 6 feet in diameter, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even in November, little light reached the ground beneath them. Carved into each tree, at exactly eye level, were symbols Thomas had never seen before. Not Native American petroglyphs, which he knew from his time studying local history. These were different, angular, twisted shapes that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. The carvings appeared fresh despite being cut into trees that were centuries old, the bark around them stained dark with what looked like sap but smelled like iron. At the center of the circle, the earth was disturbed. Not dug up, but somehow compressed, as if an enormous weight had pressed down from above. The soil formed a perfect spiral pattern, darker at the center, that hurt to look at for more than a few seconds. Thomas photographed everything, but when he developed the film, the images showed only empty forest. No symbols, no disturbed earth, no evidence of anything unusual. The lab technician who processed the photos looked at him strangely when Thomas insisted there should have been symbols in the images. That night, Thomas began experiencing the dreams. He found himself standing in Blackheart Forest, but not the forest he knew. This was older, wilder, filled with trees that towered impossibly high and cast shadows that moved independently of their branches. In the dreams, he could hear the voices more clearly, not singing now, but speaking in that same alien language, calling his name with pronunciation that made his spine crawl. Thomas Crane, they would whisper. Guardian of the small laws. Keeper of human order. Come deeper. Come home. He would wake drenched in sweat, often finding mud on his feet and pine needles in his hair, though he had no memory of leaving his house. The second disappearance happened a week later. Father Michael Santos, the priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church, had been visiting parishioners in the rural areas outside town when he failed to return home. His car was found on Timber Road, a logging track that led deep into Blackheart Forest. The vehicle was running, driver's door open, his breviary lying open on the dashboard to a page that had been torn out. Inside the church, Thomas found Father Santos's study in disarray. Books lay scattered across the floor, many of them open to passages about pre-Christian rituals and ancient woodland spirits. On the priest's desk, written in what appeared to be his own handwriting, was a note that read, "The old gods never left. They only went deeper. The forest remembers their names." But it was what Thomas found in the church basement that truly unsettled him. Hidden behind boxes of Christmas decorations was a journal in Father Santos's careful script, documenting months of research into local legends. The priest had been investigating stories told by the region's indigenous peoples about Blackheart Forest, tales of entities that dwelt in the deep woods, beings that predated human settlement by millennia. According to the journal, these entities demanded tribute from those who entered their domain. In the old days, the Wabanaki had left offerings at the edge of the forest, food, tools, sometimes blood. But as the tribes were driven away and white settlers claimed the land, the offerings stopped. The forest grew hungry. The final entry, dated the day before Father Santos disappeared, contained a single line that made Thomas's hands shake: "They're waking up. And they remember being ignored." Over the following weeks, Thomas noticed changes in the townspeople. Conversations would stop when he entered a room. Eyes that had once met his with respect now looked through him or quickly looked away. When he questioned residents about the disappearances, their responses became increasingly strange. Mary Chen, who ran the general store, paused mid-sentence while discussing Rebecca Martinez and said, "Some paths call to certain feet, Sheriff. Can't blame the path for where it leads." Her voice was flat, distant, as if she were reciting words someone else had placed in her mouth. Hardware store owner Bill Walsh tilted his head at an unnatural angle when asked about Father Santos. "The shepherd who tends the wrong flock finds his way to the true pasture eventually." Even Thomas's own deputy, Jake Morrison, began speaking in the same cryptic manner. When Thomas mentioned his concerns about the investigation, Jake stared at him with eyes that seemed somehow deeper than before and said, "The forest keeps its own law now, Sheriff. Question is whether you serve the badge or the trees." By December, Thomas had documented 23 instances of what he privately called the speaking change. Residents would begin conversations normally, then shift into riddles about paths, shepherds, and ancient laws. None seemed to remember these exchanges afterward. The sounds from the forest grew louder each night. The rhythmic thumping had evolved into what sounded like ceremonial drumming, accompanied by voices that rose in harmonies that made Thomas's windows vibrate. He began sleeping with his service weapon under his pillow, though he couldn't articulate what he planned to shoot. On the winter solstice, Thomas made his decision. He was going into Blackheart Forest. He armed himself with his .45 caliber service weapon, a pump-action shotgun, and enough ammunition for a small war. He brought flares, a GPS unit, and a handheld radio, though he doubted any of them would work once he entered the trees. Most importantly, he left a detailed account of recent events sealed in his desk, with instructions for the state police to read it if he didn't return. The forest was different at night. Paths that Thomas had walked during daylight searches seemed to lead in new directions. Trees appeared to have moved, creating passages where none had existed before. His flashlight beam seemed dimmed, swallowed by a darkness that pressed against him like a living thing. The drumming grew louder as he ventured deeper, joined now by sounds he couldn't identify, scraping, rustling, something large moving through the underbrush just beyond the reach of his light. The voices were clearer now, no longer singing but speaking in that alien tongue, and somehow Thomas began to understand fragments of what they were saying. "Guardian comes, seeker of the lost, servant of the small law." The words formed in his mind without passing through his ears, bypassing his conscious understanding and speaking directly to something deeper and more primitive. Thomas found himself in the circle of ancient oaks without remembering how he'd gotten there. The carved symbols were glowing now with a phosphorescent light that pulsed in rhythm with the drumming. At the center of the circle, the disturbed earth had opened into a perfect spiral staircase descending into absolute darkness. Standing around the circle's perimeter were figures he recognized: Rebecca Martinez, Father Santos, others he couldn't immediately place but who wore clothing from different eras. Their eyes held an otherworldly light, and when they spoke, their voices harmonized with the alien chorus rising from the spiral staircase. "Sheriff Crane," Rebecca said, though her lips didn't move. "You've been faithful to human law for 31 years. Now you can serve a higher law. A deeper authority." "The forest has been patient," Father Santos added, his clerical collar somehow still perfectly white despite weeks in the wilderness. "But patience has limits. The old covenant must be renewed." Thomas tried to back away, but found his feet rooted to the spot. His service weapon felt impossibly heavy in his hands, and when he tried to draw it, his arms wouldn't obey his commands. "You felt the calling for weeks now," the figures said in unison. "The dreams, the lost time, the way your understanding of order has begun to expand. You know there are laws older than human civilization. Powers that govern the spaces between spaces." The spiral staircase began to glow with that same phosphorescent light, and from its depths rose shapes that Thomas's mind refused to process fully. Ancient, vast, patient beyond human comprehension. They had waited centuries for the right moment to reclaim their dominion over the forest. They needed servants who understood authority, who could maintain order among the human population while serving deeper masters. "Become our sheriff," the voices whispered. "Keep the peace between worlds. Ensure the old laws are respected." Thomas felt something burning against his chest and looked down to see his badge glowing with the same otherworldly light as the symbols. The metal was growing hot, then searing, branding itself into his flesh. But with the pain came understanding, purpose that transcended his human limitations. When he woke, he was standing in his own kitchen, fully dressed in his uniform, badge gleaming against his chest. The clock read 6 a.m. On his kitchen table lay a report in his own handwriting: "Missing persons investigation concluded. Martinez and Santos believed to have relocated voluntarily. Cases closed." Thomas stared at the report, trying to remember writing it. He couldn't. But as he read the words, they made perfect sense. People left small towns all the time. There was nothing unusual about it. Over the following months, Thomas noticed changes in himself. His need for sleep decreased until he was functioning perfectly on 2 hours per night. His senses sharpened until he could see clearly in complete darkness, hear conversations from impossible distances. Most importantly, he began to understand his true role. For 31 years, he'd enforced human laws. Now he served as liaison between the human community and the older authorities that governed Blackheart Forest. When hikers went missing, he filed reports indicating they'd left voluntarily. When residents asked too many questions about strange sounds or lights in the forest, he had quiet conversations with them about the benefits of minding one's own business. The townspeople adapted quickly. Crime dropped to zero. Domestic disputes ended before they began. Even traffic violations became things of the past. Millfield achieved a harmony that drew attention from sociologists and law enforcement professionals across the region. Thomas began receiving invitations to speak at conferences about community policing. Other sheriffs requested consultations on his methods. Slowly, carefully, he began sharing certain insights about maintaining order through respect for natural hierarchies and ancient wisdom. The influence spread. Within 2 years, similar changes appeared in counties across 3 states. Sheriffs who attended Thomas's seminars returned to their jurisdictions with new perspectives on law enforcement. Missing persons reports decreased. Communities achieved unprecedented peace and stability. And deep in Blackheart Forest, ancient things that had slept for centuries continued their patient work, weaving human servants into a network that would eventually span the continent. They were in no hurry. They had waited this long, they could wait a little longer. Sheriff Thomas Crane continued his duties with unprecedented efficiency, maintaining perfect order in his jurisdiction while serving masters whose names predated human language. His badge had become more than a symbol of authority, it was a conduit for powers that governed the spaces between human understanding and primordial truth. Sometimes, in quiet moments, fragments of his original self would surface like debris from a shipwreck. But these episodes grew rarer and briefer, until finally they stopped altogether. He had been a good sheriff when he served human law. He was a perfect warden now that he served the deeper authorities that had never truly relinquished their claim to the land. The forest kept its own law now. And Thomas Crane was its faithful servant.